So this is the second section of the religious and belief systems in Australia after 1945. In this first dot point, what we look at is the religious landscape in Australia, and particularly we look at the changing patterns of religious adherence. So what we're doing is we're looking at how the number of adherents and the percentage of adherents to different religions and to different denominations and variants within those religions has changed over time in Australia. So our focus is on after 1945, but we need to look obviously a little bit before 1945 too, so that we have a bit of an understanding of what was going on before then as well. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the changes to religious adherence in Australia generally, just a bit of an overview. Then we're going to look at the changes to Christian adherence in particular. So we'll have a look at the changes over time for Christianity, in particular different denominations within Christianity. Then we'll have a look at the rise of secularism, changing Jewish adherence, and also Hindu, Islam, Buddhism, and their growth in Australia, particularly in the past few decades. The first thing that we really need to understand to do this is that what you're actually required to do in this is first of all, you need to have a good understanding of how the religious adherence changed over time, and more importantly, why religious adherence changed over time. And that's more the focus of the second dot point, is the reasons why. So this dot point's a bit about how it changed. The next dot point's more about why it changed over time. But what's really important too is that you need to be not only know roughly what the religious landscape is sort of now and why it is that way, but also you need to be able to accurately interpret graphs and tables of information from the census data, which is put out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And so I suppose the best place to start would be to have a look at what the census is. The census is conducted, censuses have been around for millennia, but they're conducted essentially to find out information about society and the people who are living in the society, so that the government can target policies towards certain groups of people within society in different geographical locations. So it gives the government a snapshot of the ages, the occupations, the wealth, the population number, religious adherence, employment, all these sorts of things, number of children, so that they can target policies that more accurately reflect the population that they're catering for. So that's the purpose of the census. And some of the census data, or what the census data also collects, is information about religious adherence. And it's quite interesting when you look at how that can be interpreted and the story it tells about Australia. And it's all interlinked with lots of other factors like migration, like changing policies, and those sorts of things. It tells a bit of the story of Australia's history as we go through. One thing that we need to understand too is that prior to 1954, the census was taken every 10 years. And then after 1954, the census was taken every 5 years. So every 5 years now we have a census. And what we also find is that we have different changes. We have one particular change, which happens when we look at a change to the wording in the census. But I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. The first thing we need to look at is what Australia was like prior to 1945. And the census that we look at is 1947. That was the first census after 1945. But we have to have an understanding of what Australia was like prior to 1945. And it starts right back at the beginning, where we have the settlement of Australia predominantly by British. So the British came, and with them they brought the Church of England. So the Anglican Church came with the original British settlers. So Christianity was by far and away, excluding Aboriginal spirituality, the dominant religion in Australia prior to at the time of settlement. And from then on, and still today, Christianity is still the dominant religion. But the dominant denomination was the Church of England for a very long time. There were also a lot of Catholics as well, and predominantly they came from transported Irish Catholics. And later free Catholics, and also free Irish settlers who came over to Australia too. And what we see too over time is there's a whole lot of immigration that we look at from Irish countries as well, prior to 1945, and from some other countries too. But that's sort of the story it is prior to 1945, and then we'll have a look at what it changes to after 1945 and those impacts that those areas have had as well. What's important too is that we have to understand how the questions are actually phrased on the census, because they can change the way people will. It helps us understand how people will have interpreted the questions and why they'll have written what they've written. So there have been lots and lots of changes to the way the census has been constructed over time, and we need to really understand that so we can understand how these changes have taken place. So to begin with, what they had in terms of list your religion on the Australian census for a long time was just a list of Christian variants. That was it. So all you had was sort of Anglican, Protestant, Catholic, Congregationalist, whatever. So they'd have this list of Christian denominations, and then you essentially chose one for yourself. And there was also the option for other religions as well. So if you were an other religion, which could have been anything, but they weren't specific, they didn't ask you to write down what you actually were if you ticked other religion. So we didn't really find out much about these other religions and where people were or what religions people were following for a long period of time. And the other option we had was that a lot of people left that question entirely blank, so they didn't indicate whether they had a religion. So did that mean that they weren't comfortable indicating that they were a specific religion? Did they not want people to know that they were not Christian, or were they atheists? Did they not believe in anything? So that sort of makes a lot of those responses in this period of time, the early period of time, quite vague, and doesn't give us a great understanding of what was going on at the time. The next thing we have to understand is that by 1947, it was made clear to people who were filling out the census that responses to the questions on religion were voluntary. And what we have is people in 1940s, or sort of from 1947, we have people choosing more and more not to fill out that question, so not to write down what their religious adherence is. And that's for a variety of different reasons. Some people feared persecution because of or non-acceptance because of their religion. Some people just didn't think it was the government's business what religion they had, all those sorts of things. So that was another change to the census. 1971 was the next major change, and this was the addition of a question in the census, and what that question was: if no religion, write none. So, in other words, it made it really specific for people. So instead of having people who were choosing not to fill out that question because they didn't fit into any of the categories, they were not no religion, and they weren't. So they didn't have their religion listed, or they were choosing not to fill out the question for one reason or another. This was for people who wanted to indicate that they actually didn't have a religion, that they're actually atheist. They didn't practice any religion. So this really changed things for then on. The next factor we need to examine is the impact of World War II. And what essentially came about from World War II, particularly the fact that Australia was attacked with Sydney Harbour having midget submarines in it and Darwin being bombed, was that Australia just did not have a population to sustain a war effort, I suppose, is one way. We didn't have the infrastructure or the skilled labour to build one. And we didn't have enough people, I suppose, to protect Australia's vast shoreline as well. So from that led to a big push for immigration into Australia post-World War II. The original target for that, based on Australia's sort of White Australia policy, which was the policy that we wanted to keep Australia white and was to limit migration from other non-British countries initially, was that we really just wanted British migrants. So there was a big push to have British migrants come out to Australia immediately following World War II. When we didn't get the response that we were hoping for from British migrants, so we started opening up to, and when I say British migrants, it means sort of Scottish, Irish, British, Welsh, all those sorts of things. When we didn't get the original response that we wanted, or the size of response that we wanted from that, it was broadened to include other sort of Mediterranean, European people. And that's had an impact on Australia too, with an increasing number of Catholic adherents from countries like Italy and Malta and Orthodox Christians from countries like Greece, etc. So that took a change to Australia's religious landscape as well. The following World War II, we also took in a large number of Jewish refugees who were looking to be rehomed after the atrocities of the Holocaust in World War II. The Vietnam War, which came during the late 60s and early 1970s, also led to led to the end of Australia's White Australia policy that officially ended in 1973, but it had been sort of becoming less and less harsh as time went on. And what we saw was a lot of Asian migration following that. A lot of Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese and Lao refugees following the Vietnam War, and then what we saw is more of an opening of the doors to these countries, and that has led to again another change in the religious landscape with an increase in the number of Buddhist adherents in Australia. Other impacts that we've had, the end of the White Australia policy has also led to an increase in the number of Islamic and Hindu adherents from people from the Middle East and people from India, etc., who've moved to Australia as well as other Catholic groups like the Lebanese community, the large percentage of Maronites who've come to Australia from Lebanon, the Middle East, and large number of Catholic adherents, for example, from the Philippines and those sorts of things. We've also had some other impacts, for example, the rising or increase in secularism, which means that people who don't believe in religion and believe religion should be completely separated from the state, and also the rise of New Age spiritualities, which are sort of new spiritualities which have sort of cropped up, a lot of them based on sort of ancient religions and Eastern religions, so based on things like yoga and Tai Chi, and also other things like Wicca and numerology and astrology and those sorts of things. And that's happened in the last sort of 3 decades for a variety of different reasons. So the next thing we'll have a quick look at is the changes to the Christian adherence over time. So as we said, Australia was prior to sort of 1947, Australia was quite dominated by Anglican adherents. But since 1947, the Anglican numbers in Australia and the percentage of Anglican adherents in Australia have declined. So in 1947, there was 39% of the population was Anglican, and this is predominantly due to the fact that we had, the British were the first people to settle Australia, and that's dropped down to around 17%, and only 5% of those are actually attending church on a weekly basis. In terms of Catholic adherence, Catholicism went from 21% in 1947, and at the moment it's sort of stable around 25 and 27% at the moment, and it's essentially been propped up through migration into Australia. That's probably been the most important thing. So even though the last 20 years the percentage of Catholics has actually decreased a little bit, the actual number of Catholics has increased because the population of Australia has increased as well. So that's changed the sort of balance there. So even though the it's kind of stable because the population has increased at the same time, it's really has the numbers of Catholic adherents have actually increased. And the other thing is that we have people who are what we call nominally Catholic, which means they don't actually attend church services and those sorts of things. They're not part of a parish. They still consider themselves to be Catholic regardless. So we see lots of people who still identify themselves as being Catholic, even though they don't practice Catholicism, so to speak. So we have probably around less than 20% of Australian Catholics who actually attend Mass weekly. So that kind of maybe props the numbers up a little bit in terms of Catholicism, because they still identify so strongly with being Catholic, despite not attending services. In terms of the Presbyterian adherence in Australia, there's been a massive drop in the Presbyterian adherence from 1947 to now. 10% of the population in 1947 sort of saw themselves as being Presbyterians, and now we only have 2.7% of the population. So a lot of this has to do with the amalgamation of the Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregationalist churches into the Uniting Church in 1977. So that was an ecumenical movement, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and that was recognising that they had a lot in common and that they needed to sort of maintain stability, I suppose. So they joined together to form the Uniting Church in 1977. But not all Presbyterians joined. Some of them sort of stayed as Presbyterians as well. So unlike the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church has decreased in numbers, as well as in percentage. So they've lost numbers and consequently lost the percentage of the population as well. The Uniting Church has dropped as well from 7.6% in 1986 census down to 5% in 2011. So they're seeing drops in percentage as well. Despite the fact that they sort of are an amalgamation, they're still losing numbers, I suppose. So they've decreased in percentage as well as in the actual numbers of the population too. The Orthodox Church, in 1947 there was 0.2% of the Australian population were Orthodox, and there's been an increase. It's now around 2.7%, and that's mainly due to an increase in immigration following World War II. So Orthodox adherents came following World War II. We have seen a little small drop in the numbers after in the last couple of censuses, but really the number of Orthodox adherences have actually increased over that period of time. It's just the percentage that looks like has dropped, which is because of the number of people of other religions coming to Australia at the same time. Pentecostal adherents, the Pentecostal Church is they first came into the census in the 1960s and was 0.2% of the population. At 1996 census, the percentage was at 0.98%, and in 2001 had increased to 1. It's now pretty steady and has remained steady over the last couple of censuses at around 1.1 at the most recent census in 2011. But it hasn't shown the growth that we thought it probably would have shown based on how visible the Pentecostal Church is in Australian society at the moment. So despite how visible it is, it's still maintaining sort of a low number. And a lot of that has to do with the revolving door syndrome, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but that's essentially people going into the Pentecostal churches from other denominations and then moving back out again from them. So they're looking for sort of more spiritual fulfillment in the Pentecostal churches and then moving back out after a short period of time. Another reason why it may not have increased as much as we thought it might was because we have in 2000 the Pentecostal leaders, the church leaders of they formed what was known as the Australian Christian Churches, and that's what they wanted people to put on the census rather than Pentecostal. So that might be a reason for Pentecostal as the term not having grown as much as we might have expected it to have grown. However, the Pentecostals do have the second highest to the Catholic Church, second highest rate of church attendance weekly in Australia. Secularism, it's been steadily on the rise in Australia and is rising more rapidly over the past sort of 3 decades. And this this is where we see people who are writing no religion. And also the drop in people attending church services. That's where we sort of see the evidence for the rise in secularism. So in 1947 we had 0.3% of the population who identified themselves as having no religion, and then if you remember we had in 1971 the introduction of the if no religion write none in the census data, which clarified that for a lot of people, and from that the number has increased 7-fold. So in 1971 the figure was recorded at 6.7%. So that the change to the census question there really changed how people interpreted that question, and we realised that there was a lot of people who didn't actually adhere to any religion at all, and it's since grown to 22.3% in 2011. So there's been a massive growth in secularism in Australia. So 2011 it was 22.3%, and that's an increase of 5% in just the previous decade. So from 2001 to 2011, there's been a 5% increase in secularism in Australian society. So it's really jumped up quite a lot in the past decade. I've already mentioned Jewish adherents, but we'll talk about that very quickly. They've remained steady at 0.4% of the population. However, since World War II, the population of Australia has essentially doubled. So the number of Jewish adherents in Australia has actually doubled too. Through migration predominantly, but the percentages remain the same. So the percentage of Jewish adherents in Australia hasn't really changed, but the number of adherents has actually doubled, which is interesting. And a lot of that came about, the initial group of Jewish adherents came about from World War II coming to Australia, and another reason why it might be a little bit the data might be a little bit skewed is that earlier on in particular some of these Jewish adherents might have been a little bit reluctant to put Judaism down on the census data for fear of persecution following what had happened in World War II. Finally, we're going to have a look at Hindu, Islam and Buddhist adherents. After the end of the White Australian policy, we've had massive increases, well not massive, but significant increases rather in the number of Hindu, Islam and Buddhist adherents in Australia. So in the 1947 census, they each had less than 0.1% of the population. They were too small to register. Now Buddhism has become the largest non-Christian faith in Australia. And it's overtaken Islam, which prior to that was the largest non-Christian faith in Australia. So in 1986, Buddhism was 0.5% of the population. It is now 2.5% of the population. That has stemmed from Asian migration into Australia. Hindu adherents have risen from 0.1 to 1.3%. So that's from 1947 it was 0.1, now it's 1.3% of the population. Again, a lot of that stemmed from Asian migration, predominantly from India, and Muslim adherents have also increased from 0.3% they were in 1947, and now they're in 1976 they were 0.3%, and now they're 2.2% of the population in 2011. Again, that's from sort of predominantly Middle Eastern and also some Asian countries as well. So that's the overview of where this all fits in. What I'm going to do now is go through a few of these graphs so we can interpret we can see how we interpret these graphs as sort of we go through here. So what you can see here on this graph that we've got on the image here is we see the number of Catholic adherents, and you can actually see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a very basic graph, by the way. 1961, and we've got the same amount of Catholic adherents roughly here with the same number, and that remains steady here because this is a very basic graph. But what we do see is other religions in 2001, 2011 increase, and again that's from migration. We see the Anglican adherents here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, reduced down to 3 here. So they've dropped by over half. And then we see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for other Christian, and down in 2011 we're down to 4. So we see that that's Presbyterian and other Protestant churches that have really dropped. None, we see the massive increase from 2 here up to double here in 2011. We see a massive increase in people not identifying with any religion, and the figures of people who are not stating their religion has remained roughly the same. So again, what we need to remember here is this shows the rise of secularism. This shows the decline of people adhering to Christianity, and that can be related to secularism as well. Anglican Church, we've mentioned why that percentage have dropped off there. Again, it's secularism, but also immigration. And here the Catholic Church has been propped up by immigration as well. And here we see clearly immigration, particularly from from the Asian countries, particularly. So this is a graph which shows the state of religion in Australia in 1981, and you can see here that the Anglican adherents are right up here at about 40% of the population, and then we see the Catholic adherents at 20%, and then other, which is your other Christian adherents here. We see that's all Christianity here. So what we'll see in the next slide is how much that's changed. So other religions is only 1.4%. No religion, because that question was introduced in 1971. And people who are not really filling out the census properly, or they're not stating it properly here. So you can see here 2006, we can see a massive drop. This was right up here at about 40%, and it's dropped down to 18.7%. This is 2006. We've seen an increase here of Catholic adherents. Again, that's migration or immigration. We've seen a decline here, which was around 30-odd%. That's gone down to 20% here. Other religions has increased significantly. No religion has increased massively. So again, that's secularism. And then not stated is sort of increased a little bit there too. So again, when we're looking at this, the Catholics have been propped up by immigration, and also the fact that they sort of tend to identify with Catholic despite whether they're attending church services or not. Anglicans have dropped down, secularism, and the percentage because of the migration as well. Secularism there for these other Christian adherents. Other religions, again, that's immigration, predominantly after World War II, but specifically after the Vietnam War. And no religion here is, again, secularism. So here's another sort of graph that you can get, which sort of shows here we are 1901, and we can see the blue is Anglicanism, and you can see here with this steady downhill slide in Anglicanism all the way to 2011. And then in the striped red and white, we can see Catholicism. And Catholicism has remained pretty stable here. There was a slight peak sort of around here-ish, and then it sort of remains about the same all the way through. And again, that's because of migration into Australia. So from predominantly European countries, which is where we see a lot of Catholics coming from. Again, here we are, other Christians we see here, that's remained pretty steady, but then we start seeing it decline down here, and that's, again, secularism is predominantly responsible for that. In the yellow here, which is other religions, we see here it's pretty much nothing until around 1971. And from 1971 or even 1976 here, we start seeing a massive increase. Well, not a massive, but a significant increase here in the number of other religions. So that, again, is your immigration into Australia. No religion, you can see a massive increase here. That's 1971. That's when they introduced that question, if no religion, right, none. And we see that that has continued to increase. So that's, again, that secularism is causing that increase there too. And again, this has remained pretty steady. This no religion, or not stated, inadequately described. So you can start seeing the reasons behind this, but you must be able to interpret these properly. Here's another graph which sort of shows the percentage of the population. Again, it's pretty close. Atheists, this is the term this one uses, is atheists here, and we see a decline. That's, again, secularism or no religion. That's what it's talking about. Up here we can see an increase in other religion up here. Which is your, again, migration, and you can see that increase here from 1971, or really from 1976, the end of the Vietnam War and the end of the White Australia policy. We see this sharp increase, significant increase here in other religion. This doesn't show the differences in the Christian denominations, but you can see a decline in Christian adherence from 90% or just under 90% down to 60%. In 2011, but that doesn't sort of show the different denominations. So it shows if you looked at the Catholic percentages, it would be the same, but the Anglicans would have decreased significantly. This is an interesting one, which shows religion by age, which is pretty interesting. It only goes to the 2006 census. Sorry, so this is only one snapshot of what it was like in 2006. But what it does show us is the ageing population of Australia. We have an ageing population, which has led to, in the older age groups, you'll see a higher percentage, as you can see here, of Christian adherents. And these are people who have obviously been around a long time in Australia, and then you can see the decline in Christian adherents down here. And you can see also this massive rise in no religion here. So these younger people, it's a more common in the younger people to have the no religion, and because Australia, most of the older people in Australia to have a religious affiliation, we see the younger groups coming through. Secularism is coming through in these younger populations here too. Again, not stated, remains pretty steady, and these other ones above there are a little bit harder to note. But what you can notice is that right up here, very small percentage of any of these other religions: Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. So there's not many of them up here, they're all clumped together, but you can see down here in this younger group, and that again is migration. So these young people have come through, have more immigration, rather than they've come into the country, if that makes sense. Last one here, this shows the differences in the adherence of Christianity, and again it's a percentage of the population. You can see down here an increase in other religions into Australia, so it shows that again is immigration. Again, we start seeing it mostly here from 71 to 76 is where it really starts taking off. And what you can see here, not stated, inadequately described, pretty much stays around that 10% the whole way through. No religion, we see a massive increase in no religion, and it spikes right here in the last 10 years, from around 15% here up to about 22%. So it's really risen up here over the past decade. We see here the tipping point was 1981 between Anglican and Catholic adherence. You see that the continual drop in Anglican adherence down here, and the sort of maintenance of the in the percentage of Catholic adherence here, staying at around 25%. But what we do see is other Christian adherents continuing to drop down to at roughly the same rate as Anglican adherents. So that could be really attributed to secularism, as well as just the change in balance of percentages because of immigration and the arrival of other religions and secularism, no religion, coming into Australia has thrown out the balance for the Anglicans and other Christian adherents. So that's a bit of an overview of how you interpret this data. And that will sort of hopefully help explain for you how to do this yourself, because you do need to be able to do this because the questions might have this sort of data for you to interpret.